Short barrels, 45 ACP versus 357 Magnum, and we have our Hornady Critical Defense. This is our quintessential short barreled ammunition. This is the ammunition to test through every caliber in short barrels because that's basically how it was designed to work, is through short barrels. Now our 45 ACP is a 185 grain FTX. We're rated at 1,000 feet per second. Our 357 Magnum is a 125 grain FTX, and we are rated at 1,500 feet per second. Interestingly enough, even though this is a short barrel ammo, I think the rating for this is out of an 8-inch barrel, and the rating for this 45 is out of a 5-inch barrel. So very interesting here. So I'm going to use my Taurus 605 and 357 Magnum to test our 357 Magnum that has a 2-inch barrel, and our 3.3-inch barrel Smith & Wesson Shield 45. And this is almost a perfect comparison here. I weighed both of these guns on my analog kitchen scale. It's not a perfect, exact weight, but this Taurus weighed 20.5 ounces. This M&P here weighed 21 ounces. And then I did some measurements of the bullet noses to the muzzle. A little bit of math involved in that, including measuring from the cylinder face to the start of the bullet in our 357 Magnum, including the cylinder gap, and then adding the barrel. Basically what we got going on with our 357 Magnum is we got 2.061 from the bullet nose to the muzzle. With our 45 we got 2.092, and that's just with some random ammo I found last night. So it could go either way with different ammo, but basically these weigh exactly the same other than a ½ ounce difference, and we have almost exactly the same amount of barrel travel between those. So it should be a really interesting test with short barrels between 45 ACP and 357 Magnum. So I'm going to go through the chronograph, see what kind of velocity and accuracy I get at the same time. Then I'm going to do my 10% clear ballistic gel test. So I'm going to go into plain 10% clear ballistics on our first shot to see what the best potential of those cartridges are. No denim or anything like that in the way that could potentially clog a hollow point. Then we can hopefully see how these bullets are supposed to perform. Then I'll move on to doing more of a real world simulation where I'm going to have 4 layers of sweatshirt material on this first 3-inch piece that represents hitting a pectoral muscle. After that, we're going to have a 1/4-inch medium density fiberboard that represents hitting ribs or sternum, 16 more inches of clear ballistics, and another 1/4-inch MDF at the back to represent hitting back ribs. Clear ballistics is roughly a half representation of the density of flesh. So when you're talking 3 inches and 16 inches, it's more like 1.5 inches and 8 inches in actual living flesh. So if we pass through the back rib simulation and go a couple inches, 3 inches past that, that could indicate it could pass through an average size individual. So we're trying to keep those bullets in our real world shot within the first rib simulation back here, the second one I should say, and I would consider that as a success if we get expansion and stop within that first gel block. So we'll do a plain clear ballistic shot, then a real world simulation shot, and then I will shoot at the steel target to see what kind of practical accuracy and shootability I can get with these. So let's get started with this test. All right, first up we have our 357 Magnum. So I'm going to see what kind of velocity I get with these, and I'm going to shoot single action here because I'm not range training here. I'm firing single shots over a very sensitive piece of equipment. So we'll do single action shots from our snub with our 357 Magnum. So let's see what kind of velocity we get with our 357 Magnum. .1233, 1249, 1258, 1270, 1273, and that's a very powerful ammo. That's full powered ammo out of the snub, and surprisingly it actually has less recoil than typical 357 Magnum 125 grain, even though the energy is about the same. I've always noticed that about critical defense. So pretty good ammo overall. Now our 45 ACP, we are rated at 1,000 feet per second. That's probably through a 5-inch barrel. Let's see what I get from my little shield here. So how close we get to 1,000 feet per second. 902, 901, 868, 890, 898. That's kind of what I expected. Now I will say, between the 45 and the 357 Magnum, the recoil with the 45 is significantly less. It's quite a bit less. It's a lot easier to control than that 357 Magnum. The 45, this kind of feels like shooting a spicy 9mm. That's where the 357 Magnum kind of feels like something else, something a little bit more significant there. So a little bit more recoil. But let's hit our ballistics gel block and see how these compare. All right, our first shot, the plain clear ballistics are our best potential here because we don't have fabric in the way that could potentially clog a hollow point. Now these critical defense do have those plugs that are supposed to prevent that, but that's part of my standard test to do one without fabric and one with fabric. So first shot without fabric, no fabric that can potentially clog traditional hollow points, no rib simulation that could potentially slow down its penetration. So let's see what we get with our 357 Magnum snub nose. All right. Now let's set that with our 45 ACP. Let's go take a look. All right, so both of those did kind of similar in a lot of ways. You see some bullet rollback on that 45 there. Energy dump in the first 3 inches, you know, pretty similar. So they're both delivering a good amount of shock right there, hitting that first 3-inch piece, which means they're likely expanding out before they would hit a rib simulation. So overall, not bad. I'm gonna be honest here though, it looks like the entire track is bigger with our 45, and that's to be expected because, you know, it is a bigger bullet starting out. But our 357 Magnum really put its energy in there and slowed down quicker because it's a lighter bullet. But what we got going on with our 357 Magnum for penetration is 14 3/4 inches of penetration. I know sometimes parallax will make that look like it's a little bit further up, but from a straight on view, 14 3/4. Then we have some rollback with the 45. Typically that happens when that bullet expands a lot bigger than its starting diameter. And then even if it shrinks down a little bit from peeling the petals back, it'll still roll back in that channel. But what we got going on there is we get about 17 inches with our 45 ACP. So both of these are performing really well in plain gel. Now let's see how they do with fabric and rib simulation in there from our real world simulation. All right, now we're doing our real world simulation. 4 layers of sweatshirt material followed by 3 inches of clear ballistics that represents hitting a pectoral muscle, followed by a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard that represents hitting ribs or sternum, 16 more inches of clear ballistics, then another 1/4 inch MDF at the back to represent hitting back ribs. So I'm hopeful to keep these within that back rib simulation. So let's see what we get with our 357 Magnum through our real world simulation. Let me set that all back up and hit it with the 45 ACP. All right, 45 ACP, real world simulation. Let's see if this does. Let's go take a look. All right, so both of them stopped before going through this. So I'm going to say that they're both successful at this. Looks like the 45 may have hit that back rib simulation. And it hit it just enough that it left a little lead mark, but it actually is not even dented into that. So in my opinion, that is perfect penetration. Absolutely perfect. Our 357 Magnum, you know, it didn't go as far because, you know, you're losing a little bit of momentum being such a lighter bullet. But like I was thinking, I'm thinking these are expanding right away before it hit this. Now let's take a look here at our first rib simulation, and absolutely both of them are expanding. What's interesting though is they both are about the same size hole. On some tactical notes, the expansion's better with the 357 Magnum, but in reality, the size of the bullets are probably very, very similar overall. So I would say both of those did about as well as each other in this test. So looking at our 357 Magnum, energy dump with both these right away, which we typically don't see a lot of times when we put fabric in there. So that's good. That plug is doing its job, still allowing it to expand right away. With our 357 Magnum, good damage path and everything here. And we got a total penetration of 14.25 inches of penetration, good expansion. Our 45 ACP went right to our rib simulation, which is at 19 inches, and it looks like pretty good expansion. It doesn't look as consistent as the 357 Magnum, and that's obviously because it's moving a lot slower. But I'm going to say this is a successful test. Both of these did pretty well. I would say our 357 Magnum, you know, as far as terminal ballistics go, performed a hair better, but the shootability thus far seems like the 45 is easier to control. So let's see how much easier they are to control, you know, at my steel target. So let's pull these out of the block, take a close-up look at these bullets. I'm going to shoot our steel target and see what kind of practical accuracy and shootability I can get with these. All right, so here's a close-up look at these bullets going through plain gel, our 357 Magnum and our 45 ACP. So both of those performed really well. Looks like the percentage of expansion is a lot higher from its starting diameter with the 357 Magnum, because it expanded out to about as big as that 45. But the 45 in its own right, for, you know, the velocity it was working with, I would say performed pretty good. Now when we look at the ones going through our real world simulation, things change up a little bit. I'm going to say our 45 was affected greater by our real world simulation here. So here they are. You know, the 357 to me looks almost exactly the same as the one through plain gel, as where the 45 looks a little bit smaller to me. So if we look at the plain gel 357 mag and our real world simulation one, you know, if I didn't know better, I would have a hard time telling those apart, which that's really good, because a lot of times, you know, here's the one through our MDF and denim, a lot of times they look significantly smaller and it's hard to tell. So fantastic terminal ballistics with that 357 Magnum. Now with our 45, I would say there was a bigger change to this overall size. But again, these are very consistent overall. Very, very consistent. Both of these did really well, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, you know, our 357 terminal ballistics wise, you're talking, I don't know, a 9. This is more of like maybe a 7.5, 8 out of 10. Both pretty good though. So that's a close-up look at those bullets. All right, 14 yards from the target. So this is going to be our practical shootability drill here. So finally, I'm going to fire this thing in double action, because I'm actually kind of training with it at this point. And to see how easy it is for me to land shots on target, you know, make follow-up shots and all of that from 14 yards. So I'm going to shoot as fast as I think I can hit the target. Now I'm going to empty these guns out, and in comparison, our 45 is kind of a high capacity. I did put the extended grip on there because it holds a few more rounds. So 5 rounds versus 8 rounds here. So a lot more ammo capacity with our 45. But let's see what I can do with our 357 Magnum from this 14 yards here. All right, I pulled one completely off the target on the second shot because I wasn't used to that recoil. And then once I felt how high that muzzle went, then at that point I could judge that. So that is kind of a thing to take into consideration. You know, even with an experienced shooter, sometimes if you're not practicing every day with that option, which I'm not with the 357 Magnum, it's going to throw you off just a little bit. Now 45 ACP, same thing. See what I can do with this. That's night and day for shootability. So looking at this test overall, you know, it's really hard at this point for me to say, you know, this one's better or that one's better or anything like that, you know, based 100% on this here. But what we're looking at here is that our 357 Magnum, I would say, did a little bit better for our terminal ballistics, and our 45 ACP kind of did better overall. because we're hitting almost the same terminal ballistics in a way, but the shootability is a lot better. And a lot of people like to use that analogy with 9mm versus 40 or 45, and I can understand that sentiment. But the thing is, with 45, it isn't really that high a recoil. I think most of the time when people say, I got a 9mm because of this, and I got 9mm because of that, and I didn't get a 40, and I didn't get a 45, I think most of the people that are quoting that it's too much recoil actually have never shot anything but 9mm. So they kind of have this idea that like 45 and 357 are both going to like jump out of your hands. As where 357 Magnum, you're kind of right in that sense if you're a new shooter or just an average shooter. It kind of does jump out of your hand. But the 45 is nearly as effective, and it's super easy to control in my opinion. So I would say terminal ballistics wise, our 357 Mag did better, but overall, I got to give it to the 45. So very interesting test. That's what you get today. So as always, comment, share, and like, and thanks for watching.